Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to episode 19 of season 11 of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown. This is the weekly podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. Last week, we were talking about Asshole, the cover of the Beck song, and over on social media. Look, I totally forgot to put the poll up this week because, well, I do have the attention span of a small, hyperactive golfer that's forgotten to take its Ritalin. Anyway, I did post the poll earlier, but I'll wait until next week to announce the results because it's not been up that long. There wasn't a ton of chatter about this one, but on Facebook, Jack McNay posted, "I'd rate this a 10 were it not a cover. Solid 9 for me. It doesn't thread that perfect cover needle the way the Kiss My Amps version, another great nether region pun, of So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star does. That said, it definitely reflects that period of TP's life well for not being an original of his, and also expresses a pretty universal sentiment within relationships." And it definitely does that, Jack. Of course, it's infused with that Beckian air of mystery that some of those more opaque lyrics in the first verse lend the song, but it's a pretty direct retort to someone who was wronged you. Bob Reedy commented in his usual succinct fashion, saying, "Good song, clever lyrics." And again, I'd have to agree that if you're a fan of well-crafted lyrics, Beck will probably be an artist whose work you definitely will enjoy. Similarly, Sarah Willis Ryan, who I think is maybe commenting for the first time, simply posted, "It's a great song." And I'd say that even though I gave it a 7 out of 10, it's definitely one of those tracks on the album that I very much look forward to anytime I listen to songs and music from She's the One. Over on Blue Sky, that wascally wabbit Steve Ursel set us off down a dad joke path that I very much enjoyed posting. "Good episode and a cool song. 7 seems about right. I'm just glad you were mature enough to avoid the obvious jokes. The depth, sensitivity, and overall penetrability of Beck's asshole is no laughing matter." This led to a series of wonderful juvenile posts about, well, you can guess what about. The brilliant Ian Winnick responded, "Sounds like a bit of a half-assed idea, Kev." And if you're a fan of the British comedy Blackadder, do check out Ian's superb podcast, Lord of Adder's Black, in which he and the equally wonderful Michael J. Smith look at the show and the surrounding comedic landscape. I knew we'd be able to have a little fun with that one, and my crew of miscreants and vagabonds did not let me down. To finish up, over on Instagram, Lisa Kelly Pennington took me to task saying, "Kevin, I thought you talked about Beck's asshole a little too enthusiastically to rate it a 7. I said 8. Ugh, 6, 1, and 1. And so Lisa tries to guess what my score is going to be each week. And look, Lisa, as much as I admire Beck's asshole, I wouldn't necessarily want to 8 it. Okay. Yeah, that might be too far. I apologize unreservedly. Let's get back onto more family-friendly footing by taking a look at one of the lesser-known deep cuts in the Petty canon and the 9th track from Songs and Music from She's the One, Supernatural Radio. It's tough to find Tom talking about this song anywhere, and it was only ever played live once during the Fillmore residency in 1997. So you get the sense that this one, it really was a written for the project song, which Tom seems to confirm to author Paul Zollo in conversations with Tom Petty. It's one of those deep, deep cuts that most casual fans could be forgiven for glossing over. Now, I wanted to start this episode, though, by talking about a spectacularly awful review of the album and this song that appeared in the British Independent newspaper. Used to be one of the larger broadsheets in the UK before switching to being just another tabloid rag pumping out the same dull clickbait tripe that has come to plague the mainstream press these days. I take issue with this review for several reasons, but wanted to pick out a few choice cuts. And when I describe it as awful, I'm not talking only or mainly about the writer's opinion of the album, but also the quality or lack thereof of the article itself. The opening line sets a fairly gross misogynistic tone right from the outset. Commissioned to write a song for the feature film debut of Jennifer Aniston, in brackets, least appealing of the babes from Friends, close brackets, Tom Petty was apparently so inspired by the romantic comedy in question that he exceeded his brief and wrote the entire soundtrack. Look, when writing a review of an album, even if it's a movie soundtrack, what value or credibility are you adding to your piece when you feel the need to describe one of its lead actresses in such a flippantly sexist way? 1996 in the UK was the height of what was called lad culture, so I suppose the author was merely catering to the 19 to 30-year-old male base, but still. Doesn't bode well, does it? The author goes on to call Climb That Hill an unthrilling grunge trudge which sits poorly around Petty's shoulders, and says of Supernatural Radio that Tom pointlessly tries to reinvent the wheel which Neil Young perfected long ago on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. Now, I've talked about Neil Young before on this podcast, I think, and while I respect and admire him as an artist, his voice has always been akin to nails on a chalkboard to me, so I can't listen to him. I did go back and listen to Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, however, and I have the sneaking suspicion that the author of this hit piece in The Independent just wanted everyone to know that he was cool because he listens to Neil Young. Because the song he cites is simply nothing at all like Supernatural Radio. Not in tempo, rhythm, melodic tone, lyrical tone, length, production, nothing. The coup de grace of this ridiculous review, however, is the author's assertion that, for all that, She's the One is a more appealing work than its predecessor, Wildflowers. He doesn't go on to qualify this in any way, doesn't mention how or why it's more appealing in his opinion, just throws that dismissive piece of nonsense away without a thought. Alongside the snipes about Mike Campbell's playing being derivative and Tom's aping of 60s folk rock modes, this is one of the laziest, most superficial reviews of a record that I've ever heard. And it closes with this wonderful admission. I have no idea what the film is about, but judging by the tone of the soundtrack, quite a few Kleenex could be mush before the obligatory happy ending. Why would you comment on a movie you haven't seen in an article about its soundtrack? Either watch the movie for context or mention it only in passing. This kind of sloppy, half-assed nonsense is the type of writing that can give rock critics a bad name. And I'll leave a link in the episode notes if you want to read the whole thing, brief and undercooked as it is. Anyway, let's start talking about Supernatural Radio. This one begins with piano as the main melodic focus, with Benmont Tench playing a lounge player style lick over top of a sumptuously dark and foreboding rhythm section. The drums are dry and present, and Howie Epstein's bass guitar adds the bottom end colour to a scene that feels like a dimly lit hotel bar. Feels quite small and tight and intimate and personal. Kurt Biscara adds some beautifully delicate snare rolls to his part, and the song sets up a very specific lazy groove immediately. At the end of this initial 8 bars of drums, bass and piano, there's a fantastic little broken suspended chord that Benmont plays, quite syncopated, to transition into the addition of the guitars. Again, we have 2 separate guitar parts, both slightly distorted and panned completely into the left and right channels alternately. The suspended arpeggios here really remind me of She's So Heavy by the Beatles. It has that 4th to -6 added 7th thing that feels slightly menacing and dangerous. Interestingly too, both guitars sound like they're both being fed through more or less the same effect setup, with a nice phase flange effect, and as I said, that slight distortion. And I assume that this is Mike and Tom sitting in the studio facing one another and playing off what the other is doing, watching the movement so as to give space as each plays a small, understated lick. You know, when one goes high, the other goes low. When one is arpeggiating, the other will simply ring the full chords. The word I always seem to circle back to in these instances is tasteful, and that describes this lengthy 16-bar intro perfectly. Now, the prevailing wisdom in modern pop music is to get to the chorus as quickly as possible, and it's impossible to imagine a young artist these days writing a song with an intro that lasts almost a full minute. But I think this deliberate slow walk toward that first verse is essential in building the song's personality from the ground up. When the first verse begins, it's over this intro progression, but with the piano initially dropped out. And this creates space for Tom's pensive, almost worried vocal delivery of that first line. If there's going to be trouble tonight, you can meet me at the usual place. 9 syllables and 10 syllables. Tom again playing with syllabic meter and allowing the flow of the words to sit slightly apart from the music to wonderful effect. When the first chorus comes in, the song switches to the straight major key G to C, 5th to root. Incredibly simple, incredibly effective arrangement. There's a harmony vocal added here too, and I'm 95% sure it's Tom dubbing his own vocals on there, rather than having Howie Epstein add a different vocal track. And Tom did this from time to time to achieve a specific effect, and I'd have to go back to do some research into this to see if I'm right, but it feels to me as I'm listening to this as if Tom doubles his own vocal more often in songs with sparser arrangements. Oh, darling, too many words have been spoken. I don't want to get my heart broken like lovers do. A very fragile plea, and I like that the rhyme scheme sits in the middle. So too many words have been spoken, I don't want to get my heart broken, but you've got oh, darling, and like lovers do at the end. It's a very fragile plea, but it's very nicely constructed. And the specificity of like lovers do really punches home that line. There's a much bigger loss when you're in conflict with someone you've been physically intimate with. That feels more significant and more personal in some way. In the episode where we discussed Hope You Never, it was a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned how the B section of that song really reminded me of something George Harrison would do, especially in the delivery. With this song, it's 100% Lennon. It has that angularity and sharpness to the music that John would often bring to his darker songs. And Mike, I assume, plays those thick bends to turn us back around into the second verse. And again, we have that carefree attitude to form, with Tom dragging 5 syllables across the first line here, rather than the 9 we had to open the song. At the end of this verse, Benmont switches to electric piano, and there's a delicious lick in the push back to the chorus. And this is where the second act of this play comes in. In a quote-unquote typical Heartbreaker song, what you're expecting is solo, and then either verse or chorus, outro. And we do get a bridge section and a guitar solo here, but the change is dramatic enough with Benmont strutting around the lower octaves of the piano keyboard and a double-time tambourine added into the percussion section that it definitely feels bigger. It definitely feels different, like we're changing direction. Now, I don't often have complaints on this podcast or talk about parts of Tom's songs that I think, oh man, that could have been done differently, but this is one of those ultra rare times where I think an opportunity is missed. To begin with, the guitar solo is mixed back really low and it's panned hard over into the right channel, which means that it loses a little bit of fidelity and impact as it's somewhat overpowered by the rest of the instrumentation. Second, I do admit that I don't love Mike's guitar tone through this solo, and the part itself, while perfectly adequate, isn't as big as you'd expect Mike to go. I would have loved to have heard the guitar mixed in the middle with a fuller tone and more bass, bringing Mike's bluesy licks to more life. As it is, the solo sort of drifts by almost apologetically or incidentally rather than being a moment in the song. After a true middle eight, the piano retakes the lead, with the bass guitar adding some fabulous understated colour into the mix. We have some harmonics on the right channel guitar before Tom settles into the title refrain. I can hear you singing on my supernatural radio. It's a really strange verse, and it feels at this point completely detached from the rest of the song. We punch back into the chorus one more time before we start the crescendo into the quite lengthy tail of this song. All right, folks, it's time for some petty trivia. Your question from last week was this. What is the name of the Apple TV comedy crime drama starring Vince Vaughn, which features 21 different covers of Tom's songs? Is it A, Sad Baboon, B, Glad Gorilla, C, Mad Macaque, or D, Bad Monkey? Well, I have to tell you that I really rather enjoy making up the other names for this one. I kind of want to see a TV show called Sad Baboon. And I'd pitch it like this. Sad Baboon follows the life of an egotistical, neurotic, and wildly insecure rock star named Lars Baboon, a washed-up drummer whose glory days are long gone but whose tantrums are legendary. As he battles streaming services, art collectors, and his own bandmates who secretly replace his drum tracks in the studio, Lars spirals into a midlife crisis filled with petty feuds, existential dread, and an ill-fated solo album that no one asked for and no one listened to. A razor-sharp, absurdist satire, Sad Baboon is a wild ride through the highs and very public lows of a man who just can't stop suing people. Okay, so who's in? Who do we pitch this to? Anyone down in California who lives in LA? How do we get this in front of someone? I think it's a hit. Glad Gorilla, for its part, sounds like an indie band from Portland who definitely wear dungarees and still drive the beat-up old school buzz that they used when initially touring, because they're keeping it real, you know? Mad Macaque, that could easily be a cute Disney version of Mad Max, couldn't it? Set in a utopian future rather than a dystopian one. Anyway, look, all that silliness aside, the answer, of course, is D. Bad Monkey. And don't forget to tune in for Friday's special bonus episode where myself and John Paulson will be pulling apart Bad Monkey and Petty Country. Your question for this week is this. How is Songs and Music from She's the One certified by the RIAA? Is it A, silver, B, gold, C, platinum, or D, diamond? Okay, back to the song. So I talked about this last chorus iteration, and whether we're going to go bridge, verse or chorus, outro. This song definitely sort of moves around a little bit more, and we head back into the bridge section progression here with that right pan solo in that somewhat sort of reedy tone is how I'll describe it. Over top of this, we have a whole bunch of spoken word or half-sung exclamations from Tom. 100 million watts. Yeah, I'm picking up a signal. Yeah, it's 100 million watts, raw power. And we end with the line, I can hear Jesus singing on my supernatural radio. Before the song finishes with a long decay and some feedback from the guitar amps. And this is where this song is sort of flipped on its head and becomes really interesting for me, but thematically at least. Up to that last verse and that line, I can hear you singing on my supernatural radio, this is a fairly easily interpreted song about relationship insecurity and instability. We're never given a complete picture of the exact nature of the conflict between the two people who form the central part of the story, but when Tom adds in the element of the supernatural radio, things get really interesting and really cool. Is this an allegory to someone's sixth sense? Is the narrator saying that they're tuned into what the other person is cooking up in their mind? Or is this some sort of schizoid episode where the narrator actually starts to lose their grip on reality? The euphoric ending with that major key 3-chord progression, the piano guitars and the additional percussion, almost paints a manic, slightly unhinged portrait of someone who's coming apart at the seams. I can hear Jesus singing on my supernatural radio. You could interpret that as some sort of Damascene moment of realization within the relationship, or it could be that the narrator actually fancies that he can hear the word of God. And I really like this sort of unclear, highly ambiguous way to close out this song. It gives it the moment that we don't get in the guitar solo. If I were to be super critical of this one, I would say perhaps that you don't need that bridge, that solo section in the middle, and that it lessens the impact of the change as we head into the ending slightly. But this is a 5.5-minute song, so you definitely need something in there, and I do love it all the same. But from a purely critical arrangement / songwriting perspective, I think that the outro achieves what the solo section in the middle doesn't, and gives us that grandiosity that the song seems always to be building to. Okay, Pettyheads, that's it for this week. I did find a bootleg copy of the Fillmore 97 performance on Petty Live, and I'll leave a link to that in the episode notes if you're interested in checking that out. Supernatural Radio is, for me, one of those strange, unearthly tracks that you wouldn't necessarily expect to hear from Tom Petty. This isn't the same guy who wrote Free Fallin' and the Apartment Song. This is a guy who knows where the dark places are and how to bring them to life. There's just something about this one that gets under my skin, and while I have some slight issues with the production of the song, which very rarely happens in this catalogue, I'm still going to give Supernatural Radio a rock-solid 7 out of 10. Tom Petty Project is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. Go check us out at deepdivepodcastnetwork.com. Tons of great shows there, including, well, I don't know if he's in the network yet, but my good pal Scott Haskin has a new show coming out called Smoke on the Podcast, which is covering, of course, the music of Deep Purple. And I am going to be guesting on that show, and I'll leave a link in the episode notes to that one too. You can check out my other podcast, Seaside Pod Review, a Queen podcast that I do with my best friend Randy Woods, who I always tell you this, he performs all the music that you hear in the podcast and also composed and performed the theme tune. Generally, Randy's he's my best mate, and he's just an all-round great guy and a phenomenal musician. You can also check out the Ultimate Catalog Clash that I co-host with my great pal, Corey Morissette. Yesterday, we released the Side A episode covering Sports by Huey Lewis and the News, a fantastic album. Go check that one out. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at The Tom Petty Project. Also on Blue Sky at Tom Petty Project. Go follow, like, subscribe, do all those things. Keep in touch. And if you haven't left a review or a rating, please go do that. As a weekly reminder, the Tom Petty Project is not affiliated with the Tom Petty Estate in any way. So if you're looking for Tom's music, please go buy physical media or visit official streaming platforms. If you're looking for official merchandise, go to tompetty.com. And if you're looking for merch for this show, please go to tompettyproject.com. Don't forget to check out the Tom Petty Nation and Tom Petty Fans Forever groups on Facebook. And make sure you check out Tom Petty Radio on Channel 31 on Sirius XM. Until we meet again next week, keep listening to and sharing Tom's music. Try to be kind. Try to say I love you to someone at least once a day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with you next week to talk about a song that feels really pertinent at the moment. The Wildflowers Cast Off, California. Bye-bye.